Okay, well, welcome back, folks. Let's see. So first item is from Eric.
Yeah, so one of the things that I noticed last week in one of the PRs, and it was mentioned in the PR, is the experimental ambient branch isn't necessarily being kept up to date with the changes in the other branches. Well, with the changes that would show up in the master branches and the other repos. So for example, there's an Istio proxy post-submit job within its master branch to update the master branch of Istio. But today we don't have one to update experimental ambient. And the PR last week was basically, we haven't been updating Envoy in the experimental ambient branch. Should we be basically? Well, the PR was to do it. And I know there was also another PR I did last week to update the common files within the experimental ambient branch as well. And so this is just a quick discussion item. Should we have particular jobs to do that, to keep the branch up to date? I know I have PRs out there which haven't been looked at for the proxy and the common files updates, but potentially there's other ones as well, that we do, API, package, client, Go, things like that. Is there some reason that we want to or don't want to do that? I mean, will it cause us more problems if we try to do a merge back? I don't know.
Yeah, my only thought was that it may be useful, but we're still diverging from Istio master as well, and that is probably not something we'd automate. And at this point, we're going to merge. We're going to kill the experimental branch and merge it into master in the coming months. So maybe it's not worthwhile to invest effort into this.
Yeah, and to me, my only thought with the common files one at least, is so Envoy, I don't know how much you guys are using that and want the changes. So do you want them all the time? But I know, like with common files, there's a common files update which contains the build image that's being used. For example, when you're running the various make commands or whatever, we do update, I believe, the build file that's used by the pipeline for the experimental branch, but we don't actually update the one that would be used locally if you were doing it local. So so to me, at least, it made sense to do common files, and I sort of left proxy as something to do, and we could not. But I leave it up to the community at this point. I created some PRs that are out there. I think, John, you and I are probably the two that just need to get together and talk about this.
Yeah, I'm fine with it if someone wants to do the work. I don't think it's the most pressing thing. If we do common files, we may want to make it like not on every commit if we can do that, just to avoid noise. I mean, it's not that big of a deal. It's just the whole automation ends up with a lot of PRs in the master branch, and it's probably a bit excessive on experimental. So I'm fine with it. I'm perfectly fine without it. Hopefully it doesn't matter in a month or so, and we'll be all on the master branch anyways.
Okay.
Yeah, Eric, I think the key is the
PR is done. The work is done.
Okay. It's just that the work may not be that relevant in a month when it's merged to master.
Yeah, and that's fine. We can, we can leave it. I just wanted to mention that. All right, so I won't worry about those necessarily. And then, if you don't mind, Fasila has her mentorship thing. I know she can't make the call, and she asked me to do it. So, if I could slide it quick up the agenda.
Yeah, which I think many of us already in the previous meeting. So
yep.
Yeah,
I was going to say it was mentioned in the previous meeting. The 30-second spiel is there's some mentorship opportunities if there's something that we want some mentees to help with. And you missed the last call and you want to talk about it, you can either ask Sheila or myself, and I'll leave it at that.
All right, I think the next topic resolved in the comments. Is that accurate, or is there anything we want to discuss here?
Yeah, Jessica, are you on the line? I do think it's resolved in the
I
comments.
crossed out these topics. John explained me everything. I just wanted to ask if pilot further gateway cluster config will be used in context of waypoint proxies, but I didn't solve that document, so this question wouldn't make sense. I will read the documents. Maybe I will come back if this will be necessary. I crossed out this. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, the short answer is the exact semantics of it. No, the same effect of attribute scaling. Yes. So.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. The next one, me and Lynn have been working on kind of a doc on putting together what exactly all the various APIs mean and how they work in Ambient and what differences there are for sidecars and whatnot. Right now, the doc's fairly work in progress. Me and Lynn kind of both went off on our own and then merged them, and they're not fully merged and whatnot. The one I wanted to talk today about is authorization policy, because I think it's one kind of blocking some ongoing work, and it's kind of a bellwether for what we do for other APIs in my mind. So the crux of the debate seems to be, or at least these are two positions I've heard, is that we could either stick with the current API where authorization policies select individual workloads with the label selector, or we can move it to attach at some other layer. What that is not exactly clear. It could be at the waypoint. So that would probably be either a label selector matching the waypoint labels, or possibly add a direct reference and you point to like the gateway, which is potentially something we could do for ingress as well. Another option could be maybe to attach this to service accounts, which that ends up being largely the same thing as attaching to a waypoint. It's just a different user experience on how we get there. So the concerns about doing workload selector, I believe, are largely around the implementation complexity, that we now have different RBAC policies based on some upstream that we've selected during load balancing, which is not something that's typical in load balancers. It makes it pretty awkward to implement in Envoy. Obviously, the benefits of the other approach is that it's very flexible. You can have all sorts of obscure policies where one pod in the service has a policy, the other one doesn't. It could give you weird behavior, like you're load balancing between a rejection and a 200. But if the user specifies that, maybe that's what they want. Yeah, that's kind of the current state. Maybe Costin or Quat, who I think have some strong opinions, could elaborate more on if I missed out on any important details, or we can discuss.
Okay, can we recap on 3 options instead of 2? John, did you meant to present 3? I'm a little bit confused because the doc actually has 3.
There's effectively 2 options, but one has nuance. Like we can bind to a waypoint via label selector, via service count, or via direct reference. But which of those is kind of not that important. They would all be implemented essentially the same way. That's just kind of the syntax that the user does. So in my mind, it's kind of 2 options: yeah. Bind to the waypoint or bind to the workload.
Right, and binding to service is somewhat of a proxy for binding to waypoint as well, right? Costin, you have the same issue you had in the last meeting.
Yeah, maybe turn your video off, see if it helps.
Or just yell really loud.
The service is like similar to waypoint. It's a bit different, but it's
yes. And specifically, we're only talking about L7 policies here, right? We're not talking about L4 policies.
Yeah.
It's a mix.
I don't think that's true. I think it has to be mixed, because you can have a policy that has both L4 and L7 attributes. So
right,
how it's
if you
implemented
have
today
both, then you're an L7 policy, right? Like it's
okay, but how it's implemented today is that if you have a waypoint, the ztunnel doesn't do any authorization. It defers to the waypoint. The waypoint has to do it all. Okay. And the reason is that it's, I mean, we could have an optimization.
Sure.
Like
Okay.
you literally have 0 L7 policies, but it gets kind of
that's an
complicated,
orthogonal kind of issue, right?
Yeah, but it's important though, because when I create
sure.
when I create an L4 policy, I'm using workload selector, right? But
well, it's because they exist in the same API.
Yeah.
So the first and most obvious question is, and this I know is something we've struggled with internally, is do we know what people are doing? Right. For instance, if I'm writing authorization policies and I'm effectively selecting service account or all of a deployment or all of a namespace today, right, then I'm approximating bind to waypoint logically. Or put another way, how often are people doing the I'm selecting only a subset of the workloads in a dimension that's orthogonal to basically the containment dimension, which is namespace and service account, right? If 99% of the time people are doing selecting everything in the namespace, selecting everything in a deployment, right, which is the same as selecting everything in a service account almost, then it would be a less disruptive change for users, or we would make refined decisions about how to represent this in the API.
We do have some numbers on deny policies, and it looks like 80% of them were workload level, which is a lot more than I expected, actually.
Well, when you say workload level, what do you mean?
I think it's looking at whether they have a workload selector or not. That's it.
No, but yeah, but that doesn't actually tell us anything, right?
Yeah, I mean, if it could be selecting the entire group.
Right. So this is the real problem that we have, right? We need to do set analysis.
Right. But if we were to decide, okay, they're doing workload selector, but they're always meaning to select a group, we would not be able to keep that API and just like have a better implementation when it's the normal situation, unless we did something weird, like if you happen to, select across 2 different service accounts, then we reject the policy somehow, which seems problematic. Because right, even though it may be an edge case, we'd have to implement the edge case, and that's where all the problems come in.
Well, right, like we have a budget for disruption, right? We could do the thing where we tell people, look, this edge case is not supported, and go and put something in the status field of their resource until they still validate to tell them, look, sorry, you need to go and make some adjustment here, right? But most of the time your stuff still works, so we didn't give you an upgrade headache.
Sure. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Way better. Okay. So my point was trying to make is that it is not an option, the first one, because it contradicts the design of Envoy. It contradicts the design of all proxy servers in the world. There is no proxy server that applies authorization at the end after the load balancing. So it's a design that it's working well for sidecars. I mean, applying policy selecting.
I think you mean option 2, Costin, before you confuse the hell out of anybody else.
Sorry, the option where it keeps the existing API, basically. So
yes.
Keeping the existing API contradicts the design of all gateways in the world. It could be theoretically implemented, of course. Anything can be implemented if we are willing to sacrifice performance and design and implement everything from scratch or do crazy things. But I don't think it's really an option for us. It will not be adopted by Gamma. It will not be adopted by gateways. It will not be adopted by any infrastructure, because nobody insane in the world is doing this. I mean, do authorization after you select the final endpoint and have different results based on what the load balancer happens to tell you. It's simply not feasible with the design of gateways.
Isn't that what network policy does, though?
Network policy, it's sidecar. So it's a design that works if you apply it locally. And it's a design that works for IP and for network policy, because again, network policy is a sidecar effectively. It acts like a sidecar. It's
Sure.
not a waypoint where it's and it's not integrated to load balancing. It's a completely different problem. I mean, yes.
Well, actually, I think Kubernetes network policy actually has the same problem, right? If I have an egress policy that disallows talking to one label,
Yeah.
and I talk to a load balanced VIP, right, that selects endpoints with different labels, and right,
yeah,
I
it
get
is confusing
weird
for
load
you.
balancing behavior, right? Like I agree, Custon, right? Like anytime you do this behind a load balancer, right, you're asking for trouble.
Yes. And confusion. I mean, users will be confused because everyone in the world works in a way, and will be the only ones that are working slightly different way just to be consistent with an API that was, again, good for a very different use case.
So we should actually ask the Kubernetes folks, like, what is their, do they have an implementation principle for what they do for egress policy behind load balanced IPs? And then their answer might be, we do the terrible thing, right? Like, depending on which endpoint the VIP selects, right, you'll get intermittent failure. Or they may say, no, we just don't select any of the endpoints that would fail. So you only can go to endpoints that would work. Right, I guess those are the two choices they could make with the current API. I don't think I've seen an answer to that in the specification. I don't know if anyone. Okay,
I mean,
this is the kind of question we should ask Bowie or Tim or somebody like that.
Yeah, but don't forget they also started with the implementations that was, the kube proxy and the particular way to implement it, and then the API made sense and it fits the design of the topology of what.
Right, but then they had like 9 implementers go and implement it and probably do this differently.
And all of them suffered because it's not easy to do.
No, so I'm sure they're aware of the problem. Like they've been through this pain almost certainly, and we should ask them.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I think, conceptually, when I first think about this problem, I'm thinking natively intuitive. I can bind to my waypoint because I have a waypoint. But if you think about now, I need to maybe create my layer 7 and layer 4 policy, and maybe I have them in a single policy. Now, do I want to use different selector for my layer 4 with layer 7? Probably not. So I think that's the advantage of binding to workload. It's just it's more intuitive to the user.
But we can ask the same question about Kubernetes too, right? Are most of their selectors really a form of whole deployment selection, right, or whole service account or whole namespace selection?
Yeah.
Because whole deployment selection is a synonym for a variant of service account selection.
But it's not enough for us, right? We need it to be whole service account selection, or at least whole service for each service.
Right, but we maybe could handle whole deployment, right? Right, as a config level, like we could think about that.
But don't forget that in reality, for us, service account is identity. So any policies that we apply on label, whatever, are completely irrelevant there, and really what matters in the end is the service account, because that's the only thing we authenticate and we verify.
We'll authenticate we can authenticate the labels of the peer, right? Ztonals do that at L4.
Both does, but it's
right. It's just the question is, does the kind of the structural building blocks, do they actually make sense, right, from how you compose a system?
We also authenticate Jot, right? Jot is not a Kubernetes service account.
Right, so there are actually many authenticated bits of information. That's not really the problem. The problem is when I introduce abstractions like service, right, and I write policies against them, or put things behind a load balancer, like what policies still make sense? Hey, Keith, want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So is the core question here, when it comes to workload selector, Are we trying to figure out if workload selector is effectively a proxy? That's an overloaded term. Is it effectively a substitute of intent for us, like a service account selector? Is that kind of the core question here?
I think it's a derivative of the core question, but it's a pretty close approximation. Right, there's an implementation complexity problem caused by any load balancer because it hides what endpoints you're actually talking to. And so, right, there's this fundamental issue. If a policy varies, right, from the consumer experience because the backend that's selected varies, right, you have an inconsistent policy. Or inconsistent policy is a good idea.
Yeah, especially in the in the security realm, that makes sense. I don't know. I can't help but wonder if Kubernetes had optimized something like service account selector, and I wasn't around with Istio long enough to know this, but if service account selector were a thing, would workload selector have even been as broad as it is? Maybe, but anecdotally from the customers I've talked to, labels are effectively used as to elevate service account to a queryable level, and outside of that problem, it feels like outside of that problem, it feels like that option is the more appropriate one here. I'm just musing at this point and trying to wrap my head around the problem.
Okay, we have a couple of other hands. Lei, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. In this model, if we want to express the semantic of, let's say, if you want to access a billing service, you must have a JWT token with identity bar. So in this model, the billing service is represented by a service account. And is that, or I totally misunderstand it?
Yeah, I think the question is how you want to select that billing service. Is it selected by the waypoint proxy or the label on the waypoint proxy, or is the associated workload label for the billing service, or is it selected by the service account that the billing service is using?
Okay.
Right, and so Kwok and John, like very concretely, the problem we have, or one of the large implementation problems we have is if the policy applies to the selected endpoint, right, we have to resolve the set of labels for the target endpoint, right, in the pipeline somewhere to be able to implement the policy. Most load balancers resolve the endpoint right before they talk to it. And usually policy is evaluated earlier in the pipeline.
Right, Envoy included. Like, in order to implement this today, we do it with internal listener, which is obviously problematic.
Yes. And so this makes it difficult to use Envoy out of the box to solve this problem, right? We have to effectively do an internal loopback. We have to run through the pipeline, select the endpoint, extract its labels, go through another pipeline just so we can implement the auth-z policy and kind of do an original destination shenanigans.
Yeah, and I mean, another issue is that now LB also has to provide labels. So it mixes the function of LB that it has to provide trustworthy labels.
Right. So we can't use Envoy in its natural form.
Yes, I agree. One thing I want to add too is I tried to scope this to auth-z because I think it's clearer and it's important, but this actually applies to almost all of our APIs, right? Like does it make sense to apply a WASM policy per workload, or do we also move that up to whatever level we apply to this, right? Telemetry, same thing. As we start going to those, I don't actually know where other things doing WASM apply it. I could see an argument for applying WASM on a per pod basis, like a Canary rollout, adding my WASM policy, I guess. I don't know. But we should consider that. We don't have to have the same decision, but I think it would be probably problematic to make a different decision for the different APIs.
So basically what we're saying is we need the unit of envoy to match the unit of workload selection, roughly, for the policy.
If we go down the option 2, right, for all the producer side policy.
Well, bind to waypoint is another way of saying the same thing then, right?
Well, but if I bind to waypoint, wouldn't you just have one waypoint that could potentially?
Yes, but that's saying that one waypoint can only implement policies that have the same grain of selection that the waypoint itself represents. So the waypoint runs for all workloads run by a service account. Therefore, that it can only run policies that select all workloads that run for the same service account. Right, so their granularity match. Another way, like for example, you could say if you want to have an auth Z policy for just one pod, that one pod gets its own waypoint.
Right, you would create a dedicated service account for it.
Well, like, you don't necessarily have to use service account, but you have to say that the unit of policy selection granularity has to match the waypoint granularity. We can talk about how we do it, but those two things have to be the same.
Yeah, I just want to make one point that I am considering adding the authorization bind points to a waypoint. I think that makes sense, especially for the L7 policies. But for L4 policies on cTunnel, binding to the workload, binding to the label selector still is a good model.
Is it confusing when, I don't know, I think if we remove this from waypoint, we should also remove it from zTunnel, because then it becomes confusing that I apply an L4 policy that's a workload selector, it works fine on zTunnel, and then I add a waypoint and suddenly I can't use that, right?
Yeah,
I would want consistency. And
yeah, that was my major concern too, because a lot of our policy, when we give example, it starts with layer 4, and then by the way, I'm adding a post method, right? So it becomes the layer 4 plus layer 7, and now you're asking me, hey, I need to change my labels just because I'm now a layer 7 policy now.
Yeah, I would say, well, in zTunnel, we were able to implement the workload selector in a reasonable way. It's not perfect, but if we did this change, it would actually be much easier in zTunnel as well.
Yeah, I think for customer to define policies, they shouldn't care if this is L4 only or this is L7. They can say bind to a waypoint or bind to workloads.
Well, the problem with layer 4 bind to a waypoint is it's confusing because I don't necessarily have a waypoint for layer 4. So I would think it would be service account.
Yeah, then in that case, they are actually not defining the right policy, right? They say this policy apply to waypoint. However, all the properties are. Oh wait, waypoint can also enforce the L4 policies, right? Only.
Yes, it can. Yeah. When it exists.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have this somewhat fundamental question, right? Like, regardless of the policy type, right? Do we want to structurally correlate waypoint granularity with policy selectability? Right. I think that's like the basic question we're asking.
Yeah, and also, do we want consistency on the selector between layer 4 and layer 7?
Let's leave the consistency aside for a moment because we still need to implement network policy, probably. So let's focus on L7 and waypoints. I mean, we don't necessarily to have exactly the same answer to both questions. We can keep L4 because it's implemented the tunnel one way and the other. But for waypoints in particular, I think it's important to take into account other infrastructures that may implement waypoints. I mean, there's a side channel discussion about what AWS is doing. Google is doing pretty much the same thing. All vendors, you know, the existing infrastructure in Google, I mean, internal infrastructure is kind of the same way. I don't think we have a way to apply policies before. So it would be highly desirable to have a solution that can be implemented not only with Envoy, but with any other infrastructures that exist today and it's used today.
Yeah, actually, I joined a little bit late. I wonder what exact questions we are trying to answer here. It's not just choosing one of the options, right? I saw two options listed.
Right,
can we just say
decide,
we can bind to both? Yeah.
No, we can't. We don't want to say bind to both because it's problematic to implement bind to workload. So if we go down that option, if we even support it for edge cases, it's a shitload of work for us to do. So we may decide that it's worth it to keep our existing API, but if it's not, I mean, we could do both, but then it's just a ton of work, right? The main discussion here is not doing that work.
Okay. Yeah. So basically we're saying we cannot, it's much easier to implement if the bind granularity of the API matches the bind granularity of the waypoints to the workloads it represents.
Yeah.
So I slightly disagree. Louis, before we continue here, I would slightly disagree. Long term, if a waypoint is shared across multiple service accounts, things will be slightly different. So let's be clear that bind to service account or destination.
Right, but I said bind to the granularity of binding the workload to the waypoint, right? So which workloads get which waypoint, right? Like today we have bind to service account. The only other option we talked about is bind to namespace or some other higher level grouping, right, Custom?
No, so you're not saying policy bound to waypoint, but policy workload bound to waypoint. That's reasonable to some extent, yes.
Right, but so we're saying they have the same granularity. Right, that's what matters.
Just want to capture the case where a waypoint is shared per namespace or global. It's a global resource.
Right, but that's just a more coarse grain. Right?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. The problem with the service count is one workload can have multiple service count. And are we just talking about Kubernetes service count, or are we talking about other identities when we expand to VMs?
Well, workloads should have a primary identity, right?
No, but you can have
you can always have multiple identities, and you can select one.
Sure, but you have a primary.
Unfortunately not.
Okay, give me an example where we don't have a primary identity.
VMs and Kubernetes and multiple.
Every major cloud provider, each VM has a primary identity.
But the workload is a selection of all of them.
Yeah, I think there's two definitions of workload here. I think Louis and I are thinking workload means one single thing running, and you guys mean workload.
Yeah, like VM, GCP VM can have GCP identity. You can also assign it as IP identity. So
the Istio represents workloads as pod or workload entry, and both of those only allow one service account. So even if you say your VM has 10 identities, you can't even represent that in Istio.
Yeah, in Istio, you give it a SPIFFE identity. But VM itself can also have its native like a GCP identity.
Right, but they're all mapped, right? So there's still a primary.
So we are just talking about a SPIFFE identity. Is that
correct? That's the common namespace we map the primary identities into, but everybody still has a primary identity. You can put as many service account, like 509 certs and JOT tokens as you want on a VM, but every major implementation out there, the VM has a bootstrap identity.
I think we're confused a bit. The use case I mentioned is IstioD and any application that's using Helm. So if you have an application like IstioD using a service account, because of Helm requirements, V1 and V2 of the application will have to have two different service accounts, just like we do, because otherwise they conflict and you cannot install it. So we end up with...
that's a quirk, right? They still logically are the same identity, right?
Their logically is the same, but it's not the same Kubernetes service account. Right?
Okay, well, let's not get hung up. Like we know we have to deal with identity quirks, like synonyms.
Yeah.
right? But for all intent purposes, those two things have the same identity.
I agree. If we can have a canonical identity, like the canonical service, then it's perfect. But we need to figure out how to do it. It's not yet expressed in these two APIs.
Right, and we could, right, as we said, we can have granularities, right, that are span identities for a waypoint, right? Namespace being an obvious one. Right, I could have a different granularity, which is these two service accounts are the same thing, so put them in the same bucket, right? I don't think it violates that. The basic principle of the grouping mechanism for the policy matches the granularity of the waypoint in terms of its selectivity for the workloads. Right? If this waypoint is for these two service accounts, then the policy is selecting two service accounts. Right? They have the same granularity. That makes the implementation much easier, right? If those things match.
So we are really talking about binding to waypoints, right? Not necessarily binding to
Yes.
each identity.
That's why option number one is logically bind to waypoint.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, and the argument is because, and it's an implementation-driven argument, which is it's really hard to do the other thing with Envoy. And also, not only is it hard, it's potentially confusing to the user about the behavior. So let's talk about the hard for a second. Well, John, you had your hand up, but I'd like to talk about the hard.
Yeah, I was just going back to something you said earlier about like the granularity matching, and that we could say deploy a waypoint just for a single workload. I'm worried that may become problematic because then, for example, a single service. Yeah, no, I get it, but yeah, like a single service then has multiple waypoints, and like, what does it mean when we call the service? Like, which waypoint do we select? We have a solution for that, but it's kind of bad.
Yeah, no,
so yeah, okay.
It's definitely a straw man.
Have caution for any approach that does that.
It's not a straw man, Louis. It's called a sidecar. So if you want to, if a user has an absolute requirement to support the existing semantics, it's called sidecar, and we are not dropping it. So it's effectively the same thing.
Right, but John's right. If I talk to a service, and one of the endpoints in the service has a sidecar, and all the others are behind a waypoint, what happens?
We need to solve this problem anyway, and I think the solution is what we discussed. I mean, we have a solution with the label selector and everything else.
Right. Well, yes, so I think the answer is that like the data plane has to compose is probably the answer.
Actually, you're right. It complicates the problem, but that's complicated anyway. I mean, if you have a workload with sidecar, the policy is different.
I don't necessarily want to get distracted by my own straw man. Like any level of selection is going to create some compositional difficulty. We have to choose ones that make sense or are implementable or useful. So let's talk about the hard for a second. Right, what we're really talking about is the difficulty of the Envoy pipeline. So we talked about service. We also have direct to pod traffic, which a waypoint has to be able to deal with. Logically, what would happen if we wanted to implement what exists today is you try to talk to a pod, the waypoint listens on the pod IP and port. If the pod, when it receives traffic on a given pod IP and port, it decorates the request with the labels of the pod, and then the policy is executed based on labels, right? Logically. Is that roughly what's happening today, or we're doing some fun?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. There's no label selection. We just push down the set of policies that apply to each workload, and we have a whole listener chain for each workload. So it's pretty inefficient.
Kind of explodes in the config, but
yeah, it's the same idea at runtime though.
Yeah. Okay.
But it could attach to effectively to the route or to deployment, I mean, to a service account. I mean, if we consider bind to waypoint to be a proxy for bind to service account or canonical service accounts, then it's kind of the same thing because we attach the policy to the service account. import to pod.
Well, if let's say we kept I think we want to get rid of each pod having its own listener for other reasons, but let's just say we kept that, but made this change that policy binds to waypoint. It would still be a major win because they could share the same set of policies instead of having to duplicate that across each pod.
Okay. So there's obviously each pod has its own listener, which is an implementation detail of Envoy. We could obviously have something else where each pod did not have its own listener, but we matched the IP and port and produced labels, right, that we then decorated the context with. Is this an intractable thing or a tractable thing?
It's not intractable. I think it's actually not that far off to implement. The problem is that it's one-off. It seems like it's a very unique situation here for Istio to implement this.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not really just Envoy either. Like, we want to have a waypoint that's not Envoy, right? Then it's an uphill battle if no one else does this, and it does seem like no one else is doing this based on the chat that's been going on inside.
Okay. So we could probably get it to work, and we could probably get it to perform, but it might not help.
But not to scale. One listener per.
Well, no. Like there are ways of solving, like, because the listener per is just a way of saying that's the way that we recover what the labels are, so we can run a policy against it. We can probably fix that problem, Costin, right? But as John and Kwat are saying, the only people who would ever use that implementation would be waypoints. And so it might not ever get upstreamed into Envoy.
And it will
we'd have to make it very generic, right? We'd have to go and design an Envoy filter, which was matched to label to attribute decorator thingy.
And it will block any chance of using, non-Istio components or integrating with non-Istio infrastructure, because that's really my concern.
Yeah, but those folks could choose to say, well, yes, we support the Istio API, but you have to constrain the set of selections, right?
Or say we don't support Istio API and implement our own, which matches. What is
I think it's preferable to have a simpler option that is more widespread and then add exceptions rather than start with exceptional cases and try to propose simplification.
Generally agree. Hence my question: what the hell are users doing today? Like, if 80 to 90% of the users would be satisfied by the simpler option, and 10% of the users have upgrade pain, right? That's a message we can deliver in the context of, hey, Ambient is a big change, but it's also a huge set of benefits to you. If we're going to give every user upgrade pain, we have to think really long and hard about this, right? And the sad answer is right now we don't know, right? Like, we know if people are using workload selector or not, but we don't actually know what they're selecting.
Yes, that's a core. The core of the issue is that we know almost everything except the final endpoints that will be selected by load balancer. And that's what our policy is currently doing. So that's really what we need to fix.
No. The other thing, what people are doing on the policy side, Costin. Right, we want to move policy before endpoint selection.
Yes.
And the only way we can, we need to know if that's going to break a crap ton of people. I don't think running a poll is actually going to help us, John.
If we don't know something, we ask them.
Of helping.
But we do know that a lot of people use IAM policy because that's what all the other vendors offer, including Google, and that's something that's a viable model. They are familiar with it. It's not a major change. It's just aligning with what Google, AWS, and pretty much everyone else is doing.
If we didn't have an existing user base, Costin, we would 100% be easily making this decision right now.
They will need to migrate anyway to Gamma and it will be a pain, it will be a migration. It's not going to be easy, but it's the right thing to do. That's really.
So can we ask a user, so basically if we go down to optional one, we're keeping the same API as authorization policy, but the semantics changes on the selector, right? So it actually selected the waypoint with the actual workload. So could we ask user to kind of reusing the same label that they previously used for workload and reuse that on the waypoint? That way they wouldn't have to modify anything in the authorization policy.
That doesn't sound right. Like, put all the labels that are on the workloads on the waypoints is kind of what you're saying.
To easy the transition. I'm trying to think loud here, else you would have
Yeah,
to
no,
tell
you don't want people to rewrite their API resources. I get that.
Yeah, I mean, because if they label their waypoint same as how they label their workload, wouldn't they be able to reuse the same authorization policy?
You would no, because they would merge, right?
I mean, their existing authorization policy could potentially continue to work without any change, right? Because the label selector would just select a waypoint now with.
Well, so consider the case, right, where I have authorization policies. One is allow, one is deny, and they're partitioned by the set of workloads. They both run to the same service account. You merge them, you get an allow and deny, and now you've broken traffic. Right, so like it's.
Yeah, in the case if it's share the same service account, yeah, I agree, it wouldn't work. Yeah.
Wait, allow and deny actually can work together, right? We always prioritize deny.
No,
Yeah,
I understand they
deny.
compose in the semantics of the API, but what Lynn was describing is forcibly merging them to apply to the same place, right? And you could pretty easily come up with situations where that could break things.
Okay, so originally it was 2 workloads. Now,
yeah, if
on the one waypoint, then we consider
when
them as one workload.
Yeah, when the issue happens when they share when multiple workloads share one single waypoint. That's that's when it would broke.
Yeah, actually, I have one question. I don't know if it's discussed earlier. How is customer always manually deploying waypoint, or is waypoint always visible to customer, or is it going to be automatically deployed? If we're saying there is one service account or one workload, waypoint is automatically deploying behind the scene.
No, so they have to signal the intent, just like injection. They have to label. They have to create a gateway, which will deploy it.
But we could change that. I mean, nothing prevents us from making automations that if you have policies or something, we automate creation. It's just not for V1 and not near term because it's complicated and we don't have yet. So
yeah, I mean, we could also have a policy like all namespaces get it by default or something. You know, there's options to automate it on top, but the underlying layer is.
I think the important point, Lehman, is we want to reserve the right to do it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we can't assume that that's never happening.
Including not deploy, but use an existing infrastructure that exists and like AWS, Google.
Okay, so why don't we just think of waypoint as another workload? You can select waypoint, you can also select other workloads.
Right.
Yeah, that's what one is.
Yeah, that's number one is. And I think the easiest way to transition is actually create multiple waypoints for multiple of your workload. If you have that scenario, your multiple workload share one single waypoint. John, you have a hand.
Yeah, I don't agree that that's what one is, because we said that you can select the workloads or the waypoint. I don't think we want to select both options. We need to do one or the other.
Yeah,
if we have to do the workload one, we already have all the pain.
Yeah.
Again, my concern is that eventually we don't want to have the waypoint as a workload, but ideally for a lot of users, the waypoint will be a shared infrastructure, multi-tenant,
Sure, but that's an implementation detail, Custom, right? Still, there's still a logical application, right? You want to apply the policy to the waypoint.
As a sub-tenant or something within a real deployment that is shared across all
Yeah,
tenants as well.
let's ignore the physical details of how it's actually deployed, but it's still a thing, and it's like one waypoint is different from another one, and you should be able to apply policies to one and not the other.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to make sure people don't have the assumptions that there will be actual waypoints that will be dedicated.
Oh yeah, they might not be pods.
Or they have labels that may not be pods, they may be in different clusters, they may be completely different entities.
Okay.
So if we choose,
are there any other intermediate states? I guess there are refinements to bind to workload that are coarser grain, right? In theory, so fewer labels, I guess, is probably another way of thinking about it. Or we have one listener per, I guess, policy selection.
But fundamentally, it's still before load balancing or after load balancing. So if we stick with principles that authorization applies before.
Not everything. You can still talk to pods. Okay. Well, I guess if we want the answer to be one, we need a plan for existing users that is thorough and based in real world data. Would we all agree with that?
Yeah.
And we need to describe how we would handle some possibly painful situations.
Yeah. I do have a question on one. I think, Louis, you just mentioned bind to waypoint. Doesn't mean there's actually a waypoint pod. Because I'm trying to think how option one works with layer 4 policies.
I've been thinking the same thing. I like bind to waypoint because then we can do the same for ingress and say you bind to gateways. That could be your waypoint, or that could be your ingress gateway. But then it is problematic if you don't have a waypoint. We could also do bind to service account, which would be fine for waypoint or no waypoint.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's why I'm a little bit leaning towards service account, because it's layer 4. I still have my service account, but waypoint, it's something a lot of users are not going to worry about if they don't need layer 7 policies.
Yes, it's probably misleading to say bind to waypoint, right? What we really mean is we're binding to the same granularity of thing that the waypoint itself is bound to, right? Either service account, namespace, or something else.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. That's also why you said there's not necessarily the actual waypoint path.
Right.
Okay, cool.
What's the motivation behind this paradigm shift of shifting from workload selector based to waypoint?
Implementation complexity. Yeah.
And efficiency and so forth.
And the possibility for inconsistency, actually.
Do you want to say bind to the gateway resource, like I mentioned in terms of API to be, we create a gateway object, bind to that gateway object instead of worrying about how the pod will look like?
If we do that, we need some way to allow it. We need something to bind to when you don't have a waypoint for ztunnel only. So maybe if we somehow solve that.
So that's why the suggestion was service account or namespace custom.
Yeah.
I mean, we could potentially allow service account and gateway, or we could somehow deploy a resource that represents that ztunnel is deployed instead of a label. Like
I mean, from user perspective, not internally. So from user perspective, the gamma and gateway model is that you attach policies to a gateway object.
Right, I get that, but there's no gateway object for a ztunnel.
For a pod to pod?
Yeah, like if I want to, I don't have any waypoints. I want to apply a policy to some service account.
Focus on I mean, the waypoint case is one I'm concerned about. I mean, we don't have to do the same thing.
I know, but it works fine for waypoint. The issue is that we need it to be consistent without waypoint, and I don't see how it works without a waypoint.
We are not consistent. When Z-tunnel to Z-tunnel is L4 only, it's a different API. We can even preserve the current.
Right. So I think one of the other options is Z-tunnel only implements network policy with service account, right, with some well-known label, and waypoint alt-Z policy is only implemented in waypoint.
Yeah.
Right. That's an option.
That's true.
We again would have to ask users and go look at existing alt-Z policies. Like, if there are no alt-Z policies out there today that are L4 only, that's an easy choice to make, right? If all L4 policies out there are just based on service account, it's a slightly more complicated choice to make, but at least we could deal with it mechanically. You convert them into network policies. Right, so that's what. Sorry, damn headphones. Again, we need to know what the policies look like, right? I think to answer your question, it's certainly a very reasonable option that we have to satisfy ourselves that is an upgradable solution for end users, and we would have to make a stronger commitment to implementing network policy than we have made heretofore, right?
No, I mean, it's also not really possible because you lose L4. You don't get the L4. What's the word? Sorry, like you can't do any TLS, anything based on like TLS. So yeah, or RBAC. It's I don't see it being possible, but it would be very nice because you'd have a much cleaner separation concerns.
Well, with network policy, we can simulate the properties of MTLS by having synthetic labels be interpreted in the rule.
Yes.
Right, John, I think you and I talked about that. There's a way to model it within the existing API.
That's
really?
what CNIs do for service accounts. They say, IO Kubernetes service account, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, one thing I actually really like about that option is that if we think about the other APIs, they only apply to waypoint. And so attaching to a gateway is, I think, the best experience. It's only the Z-tunnel thing that becomes problematic, but that doesn't matter for the other ones. So we could say like WASM, telemetry, if they apply to gateway, applying to service account. So I kind of love this idea actually now.
I like this idea a lot. Like, however, I do think you have a hard sell on like, oh yeah, this is the same as it was, except actually none of the API. You actually have to use this other API, right? Like the APIs aren't the same, but everything else is the same. But the APIs aren't the same. So I feel like
yeah, but it's
right,
also
but that's something we could deal with at runtime. Like if you had an L4 only authorization policy, we could say, look, we'll treat it as if it was a network policy, and here's the conversion rule that we applied on your behalf, right? So you don't have to go and rewrite the resource, but like we'll put admission control on it.
Oh, when you said runtime, I thought you meant like after we release and just say, oh, well, that's how we're doing it now. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Right, which is kind of the same. Like Lehman, I think we've all talked before about having some declaration on the alt-Z policy to say this is L4 only, so it's implemented by the Z-tunnel. This is logically the same thing, right?
Yeah, we can separate L4 and L7 attributes. Yeah.
So we're kind of over time. It sounds like there's no desire to bind to workload anymore. Is that true, or do we need some more discussion research there?
We still have to look at what users are doing.
Okay.
Right, and this is the hard problem. Like interpreting policy, to see the granularity of policy selection versus the selectability of network policies, and then look to see if they could actually be upgraded. Like, just because I'm selecting at the workload level doesn't mean that the policy actually applies at the workload level, right? That's the other, like, it's quite a nuanced thing to look at.
Yeah. So would we, if we saw that people were doing that, would that sway our decision and say that even though there's all these downsides, we still want to do it?
Well, then at least we could talk about a real world use case and make a decision about it. I just don't know how to get the data. Well, I know how to get the data. I know how painful it's going to be to get the data. I should probably preface it. That's actually a fair amount of work. Right? So we actually need to design for that analysis. Well, so when I say I know how to get that data, I know how to get that data for all existing usage on GKE on GCP in a private Google way that we would then have to come and share with the community, but we couldn't share the implementation details of it.
But Louis, would it change anything? I mean, if we find that, first of all, we cannot find the user intent if they really mean what they are doing, but
then we would have to go and start talking to people, right, Costin? Then, which is even more painful.
Well, I agree it's painful to talk with people, but we should still do it anyway.
No, but I mean at scale, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if anybody has the ability to go and talk to one of their large customers, what we should do is we should write down the list of key questions. And then if people can go and talk to some people and get answers to those key questions, and it's quite difficult, or we can write a tool.
By the way, this is already kind of supported because that's what we do for gateways, and since we're using gateways, so people can already experiment, do prototype and show, demo how it looks like, because it's what we are talking about is implemented, no, John?
Yeah, I mean, so we can run both in parallel, Custom. Like we can say, look, we're just going to do equivalent context selection with Waypoint, right? With service account. Like when we figure out the details of that, we can implement it. We can get user feedback on it, and then at the same time, we can go run user research to see if we have to go and do the awful thing as well as that. Right, I guess that's what you're saying, Custom, right? So I guess do we want to run this in parallel or in sequence? We could actually make that decision now.
So I think user research will take a lot of time. So it sounds like maybe we should start with the bind to the waypoint scope while we continue doing the user research.
Okay, does anybody think we don't need to do the user research?
It would be nice to do. I would hate if the user research tells us not to do it, though.
Well, it's going to tell it. It's definitely going to tell us something.
Yeah, I will at least put together a proposal of what it would look like if we do what we talked about. Maybe we won't move forward with implementing it, but so we can at least see it on paper instead of.
For number one.
Yeah, with the whole, not just authorization, but network policy, everything binds to gateway. OSCE is only for waypoint.
Bonus
right, network policy is for zTunnel.
Yeah.
Everything else is bound to gateways or waypoints.
Yeah.
John, bonus point if it's in context of Gamma and Gateway API.
Oh, we got to do. Come on.
I mean, it's the same work. I mean, if you just happen to put it in, the style of Gamma.
Okay, we have to do both. Like, we can't just ditch every API, Costin, right?
Right. Yeah.
No. This API should have the style. I mean, should adopt the patterns used in Gamma and gateways. That's what I meant.
Okay. All right. I gotta run. I don't know about others. Sorry. But yeah, I think that makes sense. But I guess let's iterate offline about how we're going to do the user research. Quat, does that sound good to you? Okay, it sounds like we're happy enough. Maybe John, do you want to just update the notes to capture, I guess, in summary?
Yep, I'll also update the doc, I think, to include.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. I think this was very productive.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Yeah. Thanks.